The fluorescent lights of La Luna Trattoria hummed their eternal song, casting a pale glow over the worn tile floors of the kitchen. Rosa Alvarez stood at the stainless steel counter, her hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who had spent 14 years in restaurant kitchens, marinated artichokes, fresh mozzarella, basil leaves arranged with mathematical exactness. Each plate was a small masterpiece of Italian-American fusion, a testament to a craft she'd learned from her mother in Santo Domingo before ever setting foot on American soil. But tonight, something felt different. Rosa's left arm ached with a dull, persistent throb that made even the simplest movements feel like an act of defiance. The bruise that ran from her wrist to her elbow was the color of storm clouds, deep purple, bleeding into sickly yellow at the edges. She'd learned to drape her apron just so, to keep her sleeves at the precise angle where the mark disappeared beneath white cotton and professional dignity. Under the kitchen's harsh lighting, she'd applied foundation to her neck that morning, covering what she told herself were kitchen burns, though the shape was all wrong. 5 finger marks, unmistakable to anyone who knew where to look. Most people didn't know where to look. The dinner service had been steady since 6 o'clock. Rosa moved between the prep station and the pass with the quiet efficiency of someone trying to become invisible. In restaurants, invisibility was a survival skill. Servers could afford to be seen, to charm, to exist in the space between kitchen and dining room. But cooks, especially quiet immigrant cooks, could simply disappear into the machinery of dinner service. Arrive, cook, leave, repeat. She had perfected this art. The restaurant around her bustled with controlled chaos. Marco, the sous chef, barked orders in rapid Italian-inflected English. The dishwashers moved plates through the 3-compartment sink with mechanical efficiency. The prep cooks chopped and sautéed, their knives hitting cutting boards in a percussion section that had become the soundtrack to Rosa's life. Everything was noise and steam and the smell of garlic hitting hot oil. And then at 8:47 p.m., everything changed. Rosa was preparing the last dish for the VIP booth in the corner, the one reserved for people whose names were never written in the reservation book. She'd noticed them arrive an hour earlier, expensive suits, expensive watches. The kind of men who didn't need to speak loudly because the world had already learned to listen. The kind of men who arrived with a gravitational pull that made everyone around them orbit a little closer. The dish was simple. Osso buco, the veal shank braised for hours until the meat fell from the bone like a prayer. Accompanied by gremolata, risotto Milanese, fresh vegetables arranged with the precision Rosa brought to everything she touched. She'd made this dish 1,000 times. Her hands knew every step, every timing, every temperature. But as she lifted the plate from the pass, something shifted in her chest. The fluorescent light seemed suddenly brighter. The background noise of the kitchen seemed to fade to a distant hum. Rosa could feel her heart, actually feel it, pounding against her ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. Her left hand, the one bearing the mark of yesterday's argument, began to tremble. Just a plate, she told herself. Just one more plate. You've done this 10,000 times. She pushed through the kitchen door into the dining room, and the temperature changed. The kitchen was industrial heat and steam. The dining room was all cream-colored walls, soft lighting, and the muted conversations of people with money. The contrast always disoriented her for a moment. The VIP booth was in the corner, slightly elevated, separated from the main dining room by a subtle architectural distinction that communicated, these people are different. Rosa had served this booth dozens of times. She knew the routine. Place the plate carefully, use the right hand, step back. Maintain eye contact for exactly 1 second. No more, no less. Disappear. Tonight, something went wrong. As she approached the table, her left arm caught the fabric of her uniform. The sleeve, which had been carefully positioned all evening, shifted upward just slightly. Not much. Maybe half an inch of bruised skin. visible for maybe 2 seconds at most, enough that if someone wasn't looking, they wouldn't notice. But if they were the kind of person whose entire existence was built on noticing things, on observing details that other people missed, they would see it. The man at the center of the booth was looking. His name was Massimo DeLuca, though Rosa didn't know this yet. She would learn it in the newspapers, in the way people whispered in the restaurant when they thought no one was listening. The Mafia boss. The man everyone feared. The man who had somehow become such a permanent fixture in the fabric of the city that his existence felt almost mythical, like a character from the crime novels people bought at airport newsstands. But in this moment, he was just a man with dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him. Rosa felt his gaze the way animals feel approaching storms, as a change in air pressure, a disruption in the natural order of things. She placed the plate down carefully, her movements suddenly mechanical, robotic, as if her body had disconnected from her conscious mind. Osso buco, risotto, gremolata. Everything perfect, everything in its place. As she stepped back, her hand trembled. It was a small thing, a micro-expression of nerves, the kind of physical response that most people would never register. But Massimo DeLuca saw it. His eyes tracked the movement of her shaking hand with the intensity of a predator following prey. And then his gaze moved to her arm, to the sleeve that had shifted just enough to reveal the storm cloud bruise beneath. Rosa felt the weight of his observation. She felt it the way she'd learned to feel so many things in the past 2 years, as a presence, a pressure, a temperature change in the air. She didn't meet his eyes. That was the first rule. You never made eye contact with men like this. You performed your function and retreated. You became part of the architecture of the room, necessary but unnoticed. She turned to leave. "Thank you," a voice called after her, one of the other men at the table, the kind man who always said, "Please" and "thank you." She acknowledged this with a slight nod and disappeared back into the kitchen. The door swung shut behind her, and she was back in heat and noise and steam, but something in her chest remained somewhere else. Something in her had made a connection with someone's eyes, and that connection hadn't been severed. It still pulled at her, like a fishing line attached to her ribs. The rest of the service passed in a blur. More plates, more orders. The sound of the expeditor calling out times, the mechanical rhythm of restaurant work that had once felt like meditation and now felt like survival. Rosa moved through the kitchen like a ghost, present but not present, existing but not existing. At 10:15 p.m., as the dinner service was winding down, she felt a shift in the atmosphere, a change in air pressure. The kitchen had quieted slightly, the kind of quiet that comes before something significant happens. The dishwashers had slowed their rhythm. Even Marco had stopped barking orders. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something. Rosa didn't understand what. The kitchen door swung open, and for a moment she expected to see a manager with a complaint or a problem with a dish. What she saw instead was the man from the VIP booth, Massimo, though she still didn't know his name. He stood in the doorway between the dining room and the kitchen, a boundary most customers never crossed. His suit was expensive, his posture relaxed, but there was something coiled in him, something dangerous. The kitchen air seemed to freeze around him. Everyone saw him enter. Everyone felt it. For a moment, time seemed to crystallize. Then Massimo's eyes found Rosa across the kitchen, and something in his face changed. It wasn't quite an expression. It was more subtle than that. It was the way a predator's stance shifts when it has identified its target, the way a storm looks when it has decided where to strike. He turned his attention away from Rosa and scanned the kitchen more deliberately. His gaze moved across the prep cooks, the sous chef, the dishwashers. It was searching, looking for something, for someone, and then it stopped. There was a young man at the far end of the kitchen, late 20s, dark hair, a dishwasher named Danny who had been working at La Luna Trattoria for 3 years. Danny was wearing the nervous expression of someone who suddenly realized he was the focus of attention he didn't want. He looked at Massimo with the kind of fear Rosa recognized intimately, the kind of fear that came from the body understanding danger before the mind could fully process it. Massimo smiled. It was not a warm smile. He walked toward Danny with the casual confidence of someone walking across his own living room. The entire kitchen seemed to hold its breath. Rosa felt her chest tighten. Something was happening. Something was beginning, and she didn't yet understand the shape of it. Massimo reached Danny and said something in a voice too low for Rosa to hear. Danny's face went white. He shook his head, some kind of denial or protestation, but Massimo's hand was already gripping his arm, the same arm that Danny used to grip Rosa's arm when he was angry, when the apartment was too small, when his own failures in life needed somewhere to go. And then Massimo turned and dragged Danny toward the dining room. The kitchen door swung shut behind them, and Rosa was left standing with her hands in soapy water and her heart pounding against her ribs like a prisoner throwing themselves against cell bars. Around her, the other kitchen staff exchanged glances. Everyone knew what had just happened. Everyone understood that they had witnessed something that existed in the space between civilized life and something far more primal and dangerous. Rosa dried her hands on her apron. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know what Massimo DeLuca wanted, or why he had pulled Danny from the kitchen with such casual violence. She only knew that in that moment, as she watched the kitchen door swing shut, something fundamental in the architecture of her life had shifted, and the night was far from over. The restaurant fell silent. It wasn't the ordinary silence of late-night service. That particular quiet that comes after dinner service has ended and the last customers are lingering over espresso and dessert wine. This was a different kind of silence. The silence of held breath, of suspended motion, of everyone suddenly understanding that they were witnessing something that existed outside the normal rules of restaurant life, outside the normal rules of anything. In the kitchen, no one moved. Marco stood frozen at the pass. The prep cooks kept their knives still. The dishwashers stopped the rhythmic clatter of plates and silverware. Time itself seemed to have developed a stutter. Rosa stood near the three-compartment sink, her hands still wet from rinsing dishes. She could feel her heartbeat in her neck, a pulsing awareness that something significant was unfolding in the dining room, just beyond the swinging door that separated the kitchen from the rest of the world. The door that was now closed. The door that kept her on this side of whatever was happening. For 3 minutes, maybe more, maybe less, time had become unreliable. Nothing happened. The kitchen remained frozen. The silence remained absolute. And then, from somewhere in the dining room, Rosa heard a sound that didn't quite make sense. It was muffled, distant, the acoustic signature of a voice raised in fear or protest or both. Then another sound, then something that might have been a chair being moved or a table being struck. Then silence again. And then, 15 minutes later, the kitchen door swung open once more. But this time it was just Danny. He emerged into the kitchen with the posture of someone who had been physically rearranged. His clothes disheveled, his face flushed, his movements jerky and uncertain, as if his own body had become unfamiliar to him. He moved to the corner where dishwashers typically stood when they weren't actively working, and he sat down on the small bench positioned against the wall. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't speak. He simply sat there, his chest rising and falling in rapid succession, his hands shaking in a way that made it clear he had experienced something that had fundamentally altered him. Rosa watched this transformation with the peculiar clarity that comes after shock. She could see the before and after of Danny in the same moment, the person he had been when he walked through that door dragged by Massimo, and the person he had become after whatever had happened in the dining room. She understood in that moment what this transformation meant. Around her, the other kitchen staff had resumed their work, But everything felt different now. The service continued. Plates were prepared, orders were filled, food was delivered. But it was all happening in a kind of emotional fog. The usual banter was gone. The usual energy had been replaced by something wary and cautious. Rosa found herself unable to focus on her work. Her hands moved through the familiar motions of food preparation, seasoning, tasting, plating, but her mind was somewhere else. It was in that space between the kitchen and the dining room. It was sitting at the table with Massimo DeLuca. It was trying to understand what he had said to Danny, what he had communicated in that moment of violent attention. At 11:30 p.m., when the dinner service had ended and the kitchen was being cleaned in preparation for closing, Marco called everyone together near the pass. It was unusual. Crew meetings didn't typically happen this late, didn't typically happen at all. Rosa stood with the others, trying to make herself small, trying to become invisible. Marco's face was serious, his usual commanding energy replaced by something more careful, more measured. He looked at the assembled staff and said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke, his words carefully chosen. He didn't explain where Danny had gone or what had happened. He didn't acknowledge the interruption to service or the strange energy that had permeated the kitchen for the past hour. Instead, he simply said, with unusual emphasis, that La Luna Trattoria was a place of business, a place of respect, and a place where everyone deserved to feel safe. He said this, looking at Rosa for just a moment longer than he looked at anyone else. Then he released them to finish cleaning, and the moment passed. But Rosa understood what Marco was saying. She understood that he knew something about her situation. She understood that he had seen her bruises, had understood their origin, and had chosen, as she had chosen, to exist in a kind of professional silence about it. The silence of people who work in service industries, where bruises are explained away and emotional pain is handled with the same professionalism as a difficult customer. Until, apparently, someone who didn't work in the service industry had noticed. Rosa finished cleaning her station at midnight. The restaurant was empty now, emptied of customers and of most of the staff. Only she and Marco remained, moving through the restaurant's final rituals. She was preparing to leave, her apron already removed and placed in the textile bin, when Marco approached her. He didn't say anything. He simply handed her a card, cream-colored, expensive-looking, with a single phone number and a name, Dr. Patricia Chen, Safe Haven Counseling Services. On the back, in Marco's handwriting, was a single sentence, "When you're ready to talk." Rosa held the card in her hands, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt something crack open in her chest. She didn't cry. She wasn't sure she remembered how anymore. But she felt the impulse, the desire to let something pour out of her that had been held in for so long. She nodded at Marco, unable to speak, and she slipped the card into her pocket. The walk home from La Luna Trattoria took 15 minutes. Rosa lived in a small apartment in a neighborhood that had seen better days, a neighborhood of immigrants, of people trying to make lives in a country that hadn't particularly welcomed them. The streets were empty at midnight, the city transformed into something quieter, something more itself. The streetlights cast pools of yellow light at regular intervals, and Rosa walked through these pools in a kind of trance. Danny lived in the same apartment complex as Rosa, 2 buildings over, 3rd floor. She had never visited his apartment. They had managed to keep their relationship cordoned off from her normal life, contained within certain physical and emotional boundaries, or rather, she had managed this. Danny had been gradually removing these boundaries, brick by brick, until her private world had become entirely colonized by him. Tonight, Danny's car was parked in the lot outside his building. Rosa could see it from a distance, his blue Honda Civic, the small dent in the rear bumper he'd complained about for months. She wondered if he was in his apartment right now, or if he was somewhere else. She wondered what Massimo had said to him, what words or threats had transformed him so completely. She climbed the stairs to her apartment and unlocked the door with the key she kept on a chain around her neck. Inside, the apartment smelled like the life she'd been living, a mixture of cooking spices, cleaning products, and something else, something that might have been unhappiness. She turned on the light and looked at the space that contained her private world. The apartment was small, a kitchen barely large enough for two people, a living room with a single couch, a bedroom that was dominated almost entirely by the bed she and Danny shared. There was nothing particularly personal about it. No photos on the walls, no plants or art or the small things that people used to make spaces feel like home. Rosa had been living here for 3 years, but it didn't feel like it belonged to her. It felt like a place she was temporarily passing through. She sat on the couch in the darkness, the card from Marco still in her hand. Dr. Patricia Chen. Safe haven counseling services, a phone number, a possibility, an alternate version of the future where things were different. The night stretched out in front of her, and for the first time in 2 years, Rosa allowed herself to imagine something other than the life she was living. The next morning arrived the way mornings do in cities, gradually, then suddenly, with the sun moving higher in the sky and the streets beginning to fill with people and vehicles and the ambient noise of civilization restarting itself. Rosa woke on her couch, where she had apparently fallen asleep at some point during the night. The card from Marco was still in her hand, wrinkled now from being gripped all night. She made coffee in the kitchen and stood at the small window that overlooked the parking lot. Danny's car was still there. This seemed significant, though she couldn't articulate exactly why. She drank her coffee and watched the city wake up around her. Delivery trucks, people heading to work, the ordinary machinery of morning continuing its operations regardless of whether Rosa felt ready to participate. At 7 in the morning, her phone buzzed. A text message from Danny. "We need to talk." Rosa stared at the message for a long time without responding. She understood that this was not an invitation to conversation. This was a summons. This was Danny's way of communicating that his transformation was complete, that whatever Massimo had done or said had created a new version of Danny that existed in a different emotional register than before. She texted back, "Later at work." Danny responded almost immediately, "No. Now, come to my place." For a moment, Rosa considered not going. For a moment, she imagined saying no, staying in her apartment, calling in sick to La Luna Trattoria. But she knew, with the absolute clarity that came from 2 years of intimate knowledge of Danny's patterns, that not going would simply delay the inevitable. It would create a different kind of scene, a worse kind of scene. And so she got dressed, put the card from Marco deep in her pocket, and walked to Danny's apartment. He was waiting for her at the door when she arrived. His appearance had continued to transform since the previous night. He looked simultaneously smaller and larger, diminished in some fundamental way, but radiating an energy that hadn't been there before. There was something unsettled about him, something raw. He pulled her inside without greeting her. The apartment was dark, curtains drawn, the air stale with the smell of cigarette smoke, and something else Rosa recognized as fear. She had become sensitive to the smell of fear. Danny began to speak immediately. He talked for a long time, his words tumbling over each other, his sentences fragmenting and reforming. He told her about Massimo, dragging him into the dining room, about the other men at the table watching with expressions that communicated they were witnessing something significant. He described Massimo's questions, each one delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who already knew the answers. He said, Danny spoke, his words thick with something like shame, that he'd been watching, that he noticed things, that he noticed how I treated people, how I treated you. Rosa felt her hands shake slightly. She pressed them flat against her legs to try to steady them. Danny continued. Massimo had told him about the bruises. He had described them with such precise detail that Danny had understood in that moment that Massimo had been watching not just for the past night, but for much longer. He had been observing. He had been understanding. He had been taking inventory of the small violences that happened in the spaces where the rest of the world wasn't watching. Then, Massimo had made Danny an offer, a simple choice, presented with the kind of clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. Massimo's people could ensure that Danny understood, truly understood, what it felt like to be hurt by someone you were supposed to trust. Or Danny could spend the next 6 months making different choices, 6 months learning to be a different person, 6 months where Massimo's people would be watching to ensure compliance. He said, Danny's voice had become very small, very quiet, that if I ever touched you again, or if I ever touched anyone else like I touched you, he would personally handle it. He said he would break both my hands. Rosa listened to this, and something that had been wound very tightly inside her chest began to unwind. She didn't feel what she expected to feel. She didn't feel triumph or vindication. She felt something more complicated, relief mixed with a kind of horror at the machinery that had been set in motion on her behalf. He said you work for him now, Danny continued, that the restaurant is his place, and people who work in his places are under his protection. He said that if anything ever happened to you, the person responsible would come to understand what it felt like to be truly powerless. Rosa realized in that moment that she had misunderstood what had happened the previous night. She had thought Massimo had intervened because he had noticed her bruises, because he had seen evidence of abuse and decided to help. But that was only partially true. What had actually happened was far more calculated, far more transactional. Massimo had claimed her. She was no longer simply Rosa Alvarez, quiet immigrant cook at La Luna Trattoria. She was now Rosa Alvarez, person under Massimo DeLuca's protection. Her bruises had become his concern. Her safety had become his responsibility. And this responsibility had transformed her from a person living quietly in the margins of society to someone who was now, in a strange and complicated way, connected to power. The implications of this were enormous. Danny drove her to La Luna Trattoria at 9 in the morning, 2 hours before her shift was supposed to begin. He wanted to walk her to the door, but she asked him not to. She asked him to stay in the car. He agreed, and she understood this as evidence that whatever Massimo had communicated to him, it had fundamentally altered his understanding of the world. She pushed through the restaurant's front door and found Marco in the back office, reviewing inventory sheets. He looked up when she entered, and immediately his expression changed. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes," Rosa said. "Danny, he understands now." Marco nodded slowly. He didn't ask for more detail. He simply said, "The boss wants to see you. Upstairs." Rosa had never been upstairs. The restaurant's second floor was offices and storage, places that were not part of her world. She climbed the narrow staircase and found a single door marked "Private." She knocked. Massimo DeLuca's office was smaller than she expected and far more austere. The walls were bare except for a single painting, a religious icon, Madonna and Child, rendered in the traditional Eastern Orthodox style. Massimo sat behind a desk made of dark wood, and he was reading a newspaper. He didn't look up when she entered. "Rosa," he said after a long moment. "Sit." She sat in the chair across from him. "I want to explain something," Massimo continued. His voice was low, reasonable, almost gentle. "People think that what I do, what my organization does, is about power, about fear, about forcing people to behave in ways they wouldn't choose to behave. This is partially true, but mostly it's about something else. It's about structure. It's about creating a world where certain things are understood to be unacceptable, where certain lines are not crossed, where people who work, who contribute to society in small ways, are protected from predators." He paused and finally looked at her. "You work in a place that I have an interest in. You cook beautiful food. You contribute something valuable to the world. And someone was taking that from you, was making you less than you should be. This cannot stand. Not in places that matter to me." Rosa didn't know what to say. She remained silent. What happened to Danny was not punishment, Massimo continued. It was education. It was a very clear lesson about the consequences of certain behaviors. I suspect he will now spend quite some time contemplating whether that is the kind of person he wants to be. I suspect he will come to different conclusions. Again he paused. Again he looked at her directly. The bruises will fade, he said. It will take time, but they will fade. Your life, however, has changed. You are no longer an invisible person moving quietly through the world. You are now someone who lives under protection, someone who matters, someone who will not be hurt by anyone without consequences. This is your new reality. Do you understand? Yes, Rosa whispered. Good, Massimo said. Then you can return to your work, and you can know that you are safe. She left his office and descended the narrow staircase back to the restaurant. Marco was waiting for her at the bottom. Everything okay? He asked. Yes, Rosa said. And for the first time in 2 years, when she said this, it was actually true. The bruises on Rosa's arm faded through a spectrum of colors. Purple to blue to green to yellow to finally nothing. By the end of the 2nd month, there was no physical evidence that she had ever been hurt. By the end of the 3rd month, even she had begun to forget the sensation of Danny's hands on her arm. But something else had happened in those 3 months. Something more fundamental than the simple absence of physical pain. Rosa had begun to transform into a different person. She still worked the same shifts at La Luna Trattoria. She still arrived early and left late. She still prepared her plates with the same careful precision she had always brought to her work. But everything else had changed. She had begun to walk differently, with a kind of straightness in her spine that hadn't been there before. She had begun to speak more in the kitchen, offering suggestions to Marco, mentoring the younger prep cooks. She had stopped eating lunch alone in the back storage room and had begun joining the other staff for meals. And she had begun to understand the full scope of what Massimo's protection actually meant. It meant that when a customer was rude to her, Marco pulled the customer aside and explained very quietly that this would not be tolerated. It meant that when a delivery person tried to overcharge the restaurant, he suddenly became very cooperative when word got out about where his shipments went. It meant that when the health inspector arrived unannounced, he seemed to find everything in perfect order, despite the fact that the walk-in refrigerator had been acting up. It meant that Rosa Alvarez existed in the protected center of a web of invisible consequences. On a Wednesday evening in the middle of the 3rd month, Massimo arrived at the restaurant with 2 men she had never seen before. They were not his usual companions. They had a different energy, hungry in a way that the other men were not. As they were seated in the VIP booth, Rosa felt something shift in the air of the restaurant. Everyone felt it. It was the kind of pressure change that came before storms. She was in the kitchen when one of the servers came back with a request. The boss wanted her to prepare something special for the VIP table, something not on the menu, something that would demonstrate her skill. Rosa prepared ossobuco, the same dish she had made the night Massimo had first noticed her. But this time she put extra care into it. She braised the veal for an additional hour. She made fresh gremolata with lemon. She zested herself. She prepared the risotto Milanese with butter she had ordered specially from a vendor in Italy. She plated it with the kind of attention to detail that bordered on obsession. When she handed the plate to the server, Marco squeezed her shoulder gently. "He's bringing in outside people," he said quietly. "People who want to take over the restaurant. This is a negotiation." Rosa understood what Marco was saying. She understood that the meal she had just prepared was going to be part of a conversation about power and ownership and the value of things. She understood that Massimo was showing these people something about why La Luna Trattoria mattered to him, why it was worth protecting. An hour later, the server returned with news. Massimo wanted her to come to the VIP booth for a moment. This was unprecedented. Cooks did not appear at customer tables. Cooks existed in the back, in the hidden places where the machinery of restaurants operated out of sight. But Rosa understood that this was no longer the normal rules. She removed her apron, smoothed her hair, and walked out into the dining room. The VIP booth was silent when she approached. Massimo sat at the head of the table, and the two unfamiliar men sat on either side. They had finished their meals, and their plates had been cleared. They were drinking wine, their expressions suggesting that something significant had just been communicated. Massimo looked at Rosa and gestured for her to stand beside the table. She did. "Gentlemen," he said to the other two men, "this is Rosa Alvarez. She has worked at this restaurant for 14 years. She learned to cook from her mother in the Dominican Republic. Every night she produces food that reminds people why they love eating, why they love restaurants, why some places matter more than others." Massimo paused and looked at Rosa with an expression that was difficult to pass. It contained respect, certainly, but it also contained something else, a kind of proprietary interest perhaps, or the satisfaction of someone who had made a strategic decision and had seen it pay dividends. "Rosa works for me," Massimo continued, "which means this restaurant works for me, which means you cannot have it, not at any price, not now, not ever." The two men exchanged glances. Their expressions made clear they had understood the message and its implications. They finished their wine. They stood to leave. As they passed Rosa on their way out, one of them nodded to her, a small gesture of acknowledgement or respect, or perhaps simply recognition that she had somehow become a factor in a larger negotiation. After they left, Massimo gestured for Rosa to sit at the table. She sat across from him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never sat at a customer table before. She had never participated in this part of restaurant life. "I want to tell you something," Massimo said. "Something important. When I first noticed you, when I first saw your bruises, I made a decision. The decision was not simply to protect you. The decision was to claim you, to incorporate you into my world, my structure, my organization. I did this not out of charity. I did this because I recognized in you something valuable, something that should not be wasted on people who cannot appreciate it." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers forming a steeple in front of his face. "Now I want to offer you something, an opportunity, a choice." Rosa felt something tighten in her chest. She understood that what was coming next would change her life in a fundamental way. "I own many restaurants throughout this city," Massimo continued. "Each one requires someone who understands quality, someone who understands food not as commerce but as art. Someone who can ensure that the people I care about and the people I want to impress have experiences that are memorable. I would like you to become the head chef at one of my establishments. A small place, nothing like La Luna Trattoria, but a place where your vision would be the only vision that mattered, where you would have complete authority, where you would be valued not as a line cook, but as an artist." He paused, allowing the weight of the offer to settle. "The salary would be significant," he continued, "enough to ensure that you could live somewhere nice, somewhere safe, somewhere that felt like your own. And you would be doing this under my protection, of course. Which means you would never have to worry about the kinds of things you worried about before." Rosa understood the implicit architecture of this offer. He was offering her autonomy, resources, status, but he was also offering her integration. He was offering her a place in his organization, which meant she would never truly be free from his organization. She would always exist in some measure as part of his machinery, but she would also never have to worry about being hurt again. The choice, when Rosa examined it carefully, felt less like a choice and more like the unfolding of destiny. Like something that had been set in motion the moment her sleeve had shifted and Massimo's eyes had noticed her bruises. "When do I start?" she asked. Massimo smiled. It was a genuine smile this time, not the predatory expression she had seen before. "Tomorrow," he said. "I will show you the place. You will have 1 week to observe the current operation. Then you will take over. You will build something beautiful." Rosa nodded. She stood to leave the table, to return to the kitchen, to finish her shift at La Luna Trattoria. But before she could move, Massimo reached out and gently touched her arm, just above where the bruises used to be. "You should know something," he said. "Danny is no longer in the city. He decided it would be better for him to move to a place where he could start fresh, where he could become a different kind of person. I gave him the choice, and he made it. This is good.